Hello everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Claretta Treger. I'm a PhD candidate of political science at Tel Aviv University, and I will be moderating the meeting. This webinar is co-organized with the help of Libby Maman and Professor David Levi-Faur, who are here as well. It is my great pleasure to present Kirk Bansak, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. His research interests are in causal inference, experimental design and analysis, immigration policy, survey methodology, political economy, and computational social science. He is a faculty affiliate at the Data Science Institute at UC San Diego. Sorry, I will definitely mispronounce that, so you can say the correct name. A faculty affiliate of the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford University and ETH Zurich. His research has appeared or is forthcoming in Science, American Political Science Review, Political Analysis, Journal of Politics, Statistical Science, Political Science Research and Methods, Nature, Human Behavior, and the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society. Please feel free to share your questions via chat, and we will have time for the Q&A in the end. We will address the questions in the order they arrive. Kirk, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and thanks to you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me to give a talk. I'll be able to stick around after the end of the hour as well, in case questions do spill over into then. So just bear that in mind in case anyone else can stick around themselves. And obviously, always feel free to reach out to me via email if anything else comes up. I'm going to share my screen now. And if someone could just confirm that they can in fact see the slide deck.
We can see this.
All right, fantastic. So as you probably all know, I'm going to be presenting recent research in the design and analysis of conjoint experiments, a type of multifactorial experimental design. And what I'll do is start with kind of a soft introduction for those of you who are not as familiar with conjoint experiments. Conjoint experiments are, as I mentioned, a type of multifactorial experiment that traces the lineage back to probably the 1970s and perhaps even earlier, but more recently a shift towards computer-assisted administration of surveys and the ease of programming, things like randomization, has suddenly made conjoint and conjoint-like techniques much more accessible. And then beginning in the mid-2010s probably, conjoint experiments became extensively used in political science and some other social sciences, where applied use has been accompanied by a growing trend of methodological research as well. And the underlying reason I think conjoint experiments and analysis have become so popular, particularly in political science, is because the idea of evaluating choices between or ratings of multidimensional objects is just really well suited to studying many things in political science that are themselves comprised of different dimensions, right? Candidates, parties, immigrants, policy packages, all sorts of different things. And so to illustrate what a conjoint experiment is, I think visual representation is probably the easiest thing. So some of you might be familiar with what this is. This is what might be considered a typical type of conjoint experiment table. And so in a conjoint experiment, you'll see, or respondents will see tables like this. There will be a number of profiles, and most commonly there's two. So in this case, two candidates. And the profiles correspond to the objects of interest. Again, in this case, the objects are political candidates. Each of those candidates will then be comprised of a predetermined set of attributes. Those are the rows. And for each of the attributes, the values in the cells that describe the profiles will be randomly chosen, randomly piped in from a predetermined pool of values. So the first thing a researcher will do when designing a conjoint experiment is decide what the attributes will be and then what the potential values of those attributes will be. So more or less a type of multifactorial experiment. And then respondents will be asked to choose between or rate the different objects, in this case, candidates. And those responses across many respondents and many comparisons can then be analyzed in relation to the randomly provided values to understand and estimate how important the various attributes are for the choices people make on average. And so here's another example, where in this case, the profiles are austerity policy packages comprised of different sets of spending cuts and tax increases. And there's all sorts of different comparisons one can make that people have made and that obviously people could also make in theory. So due to a really influential article written by some of my colleagues in the past decade, the design and analysis of conjoint experiments in political science has primarily been situated within a rigorous causal inference tradition using the potential outcomes framework. And associated with that approach, the most common estimate you'll probably see applied researchers focus on when analyzing conjoint data is called the average marginal component effect, which Heimmuller, Hopkins, and Yamamoto formalized. Now, I point you to their paper for the most rigorous general formalization of the Ampsi, but I think it's probably useful to talk briefly about the Ampsi. So I'll provide a kind of simplified version of it for concreteness and convenience. Though note that my simplification here is primarily for notational convenience and is completely without loss of generality. So to keep things concrete, consider a common, perhaps the most common design context where respondents are asked to choose between two profiles. They're going to be forced to choose between two profiles. And also assume there are three attributes, which we'll call A, B, and C. And so random profile can be denoted by the triple ABC. And also assume the attributes are binary for simplicity. Okay. Further, let Y of I, little a, B, C, and little A prime, B prime, C prime, denote the potential outcome for respondent I in a paired forced choice contest between these two profiles, where a value of 1 denotes choosing the first profile and 0 otherwise. So what the Ampsi does is it provides a causally interpretable measure, a summary measure of an attribute's causal effect on choosing a particular profile. So for a particular attribute, in this case, focusing on attribute A, the Ampsi would be defined as follows. And what this expression means is that the Ampsi for the binary attribute A is the expected difference between potential outcomes for pairwise contests, where attribute A in the first profile equals 1, and the potential outcomes for all contests where the A for the first profile equals 0. And so given the binary form of the outcome, another way and kind of more intuitive way to express this Ampsi is the effect of setting a particular profile's attribute A to the value of 1 relative to the value of 0 on the probability that the same profile will be chosen over another profile that's randomly generated. So basically the effect of a value of an attribute relative to some baseline value. And it's also key to note that, and this is something I'll return to later, that this expectation is taken with respect to both the target population of individuals and the target distribution of the other attributes. Okay, so kind of making this more concrete, what one can then do with data from a conjoint experiment, for instance, this experiment that I just talked about, is then estimate the Ampsis for all the attributes, which will then yield results that look like this. Basically, you have lots of different Ampsis corresponding to the different levels of the different attributes. I'm going to zoom in to make this a little more visible. So for instance, we can see the effect, for instance, of having served in the Army, Marine Corps, or Navy relative to not having any military experience on the probability that a voter is going to support a particular candidate. We can look at the estimates themselves or look at the relative magnitudes of these things to understand which attributes seem to be more important in actually making voters choose. Going back to the example of austerity packages, right, we can generate a plot like this. I'll zoom in and we can look at, for instance, the relative importance of different types of spending cuts and tax increases. Okay. So as I mentioned, in addition to extensive use of conjoint experiments in applied research over the past decade, more recently, particularly in the past 3 or 4 years, there's been a surge in methodological research as well. There's lots of different strands of methodological research, some of which are overlapping. And so here I'll provide an attempt at a delineation of this growing corpus. I apologize, I'm undoubtedly missing stuff here. But what I want to do for the rest of today's talk is go over some of these different strands of research, in particular focusing on some of my own work, since that's obviously what I know best, but also try to highlight different areas where there's a lot of ongoing work and areas I think that are really ripe for more research in the future. Okay, so for those of you who have in the past or thinking about running or designing conjoint experiments, you might know that once you've developed your research question within your particular subject matter domain and come up with ideas for what the attributes are interesting, what attributes would be interesting to look at, there's still a number of nitty-gritty choices you need to make. These include which or how many attributes per profile, how many profiles per task, how many tasks per respondent, should you use a forced choice or rating, or these are just a few choices you have to make. And a broad goal that's motivated some of my own research is trying to figure out how these various design choices affect the inferences we can draw from conjoint applications to try to better understand if there are constraints we must impose on our designs. And one type of constraint of primary interest relates to satisficing and the quality of survey response. And the conjoint dimensions we theoretically expect to be most sensitive to increase in satisficing are the number of attributes and number of tasks, which leads to our research questions. How many attributes can a conjoint profile include? And how many conjoint tasks can respondents be asked to complete before survey satisficing begins to impose unacceptable costs on response quality, right? Basically just starts to distract people too much that we can't actually draw inferences from what they're doing. So one of the advantages of conjoint analysis, and a reason it's become quite popular, is that it's an efficient method to test the effects of many attributes simultaneously, and then to measure multidimensional preferences. And so that would by itself suggest loading conjoint tables up with many, many attributes. But of course, the problem with that is that could lead to excessive survey satisficing, since more attributes will lead to more complex tables. The problem of survey satisficing then would suggest keeping the number of attributes on a table very, very small, right? And taking this route, however, can actually lead to two different problems. So first, and more obviously, limiting the number of attributes that's included will limit the amount of features one can explore. Less obvious, however, is the second problem, what we call masking. Masking, this is the issue that the estimated effect of an attribute can change in the presence or absence of other attributes. And this occurs because respondents may react not only to a particular attribute itself, but also perceived correlation of that attribute with other things that are not included in the table. And so, for instance, to make this more concrete, I might be presented with this table where I'm asked to select my preferred presidential candidate. I'm not given variation in the party, so I won't be using that to make my decision. Perhaps instead I'll focus on education at the top of the table. Now, it could be that I put a slight premium on more highly educated people in general because I think education is a measure of competence. However, this might be a slight premium. And while this might be a slight premium, I might more importantly believe that education is highly correlated with preferences on policy issues that I care about most. Perhaps, let's say, same-sex marriage, position on abortion, or position on healthcare. If there are many people like me, then the results of this conjoint analysis may find very large effects of the education attribute, even if people don't care too much about education in and of itself, but are rather reacting to education because of its perceived correlation with policy preferences. Now let's consider an alternative version of the table here. So here, in addition to the attributes in the previous table, including education, we have many, many more, and even more, so I'm kind of scrolling back and forth, including policy issues on key areas. So now I and other people like me will no longer pay attention to the education attribute. I'm going to make my selections based on the policy issue positions, and hence the estimated effect of education will be attenuated under this conjoint design as compared to the simpler design with just 4 attributes shown here. Now, it's key to recognize that this phenomenon of masking does not invalidate identification or the definition of the Ampsi. It's key to note that the Ampsi is defined with respect to the full set of included attributes. Masking can, however, complicate one's interpretation of the results, and oftentimes we care just as much about the interpretation as the underlying estimate. So in light of masking, one should ideally include as many attributes as appropriate given the theoretical question at hand. But of course, we can't include absolutely everything. So how can we then manage this trade-off between satisficing and masking? What constraints are there on the number of attributes we can include on conjoint tables? The second question on the relationship between satisficing and the number of conjoint tasks asked of respondents, I think, is much more straightforward. So as you may know, researchers using conjoint experiments generally ask respondents to complete multiple tasks, that is, rate or compare multiple profiles or sets of profiles, and common practices are probably somewhere between 4 to 10 tasks per experiment. And the ability to have respondents rate many profiles is obviously an advantage of conjoint experiments, as it will produce more data and hence increase one's statistical power. But of course, there's a long-standing view acknowledged by a wide variety of survey research experts that it's risky to administer overly long, repetitive, or boring survey instruments, as respondents are likely to lose attention or motivation as they proceed. And this may theoretically be even more of a problem in the conjoint context, since conjoint questions can involve evaluating rich information profiles and can be more cognitively demanding than typical survey questions. So the question then becomes, how many tasks can we give respondents without sacrificing response quality. Right. So to answer both of these questions on the number of attributes and the number of tasks, we've undertaken a set of survey experiments to directly investigate the sensitivity of survey response quality to satisficing as the number of attributes and the number of tasks is varied. And so to preview our results, we find that conjoint designs are surprisingly robust to satisficing on both of those dimensions. That is, satisficing, it's not that it doesn't happen, but that it appears to be not that much of a binding constraint, or not as much of a binding constraint as we previously thought it might be. Okay, so the first study addresses the number of attributes. And specifically, we wanted to investigate roughly how many attributes is reasonable to include in a conjoint profile without making tasks overly prone to satisficing. Right? And so the challenge with this line of inquiry, of course, is trying to isolate the effect of satisficing from that of masking. The problem, as already described, is that adding attributes can lead to both increased satisficing and the elimination of masking. And these two phenomena can both affect survey response patterns and do so in similar ways. For instance, both of these things might lead to an attenuation of the estimated Ampsis or partial R-squares, another metric that people might use to measure the importance of attributes. Our focus, however, is specifically on attenuation resulting from satisficing, from survey response degradation. So to deal with this challenge, we developed a two-stage experimental design. It begins with a set of core attributes of interest which are known to be important for respondent choice and whose effects we will ultimately be interested in tracking. And the first stage focuses on identifying other attributes, which we'll call filler attributes, which are not masked by the core attributes. And I don't have time to go into all the detail on this, but for this stage, we came up with a novel experimental design and a set of really conservative metrics to empirically identify attributes that have no perceived correlation with the core attributes. That is, we made sure that these were things that respondents did not associate with the core attributes and hence could not passively mask them. Then in the second stage, that proceeds with a follow-up set of experiments in which we measure changes in the effects of the core attributes as we vary the number of non-masking fillers that were identified from the first stage. And we implemented this two-stage design in two topical domains, hotel room choice and candidate choice with pre-registered specifications. And so the results from our second stage are the core contribution here. So having, as I mentioned, identified pools of non-masking fillers in the first stage, we then proceeded to the second stage, and that employed a pretty familiar conjoint design. And then we used a paired profile design implemented first on MTurk and then replicated on SSI, in which all profiles contained the 4 core attributes. And in addition, we randomly varied the number of non-masking fillers across respondents. That's allowing us to assess changes in the core attribute Ampsis and partial R-squares as fillers were added. So here is an example from the hotel version. We have 2 hotel room packages that people are asked to choose between. And in this example, we can see that in addition to 4 core attributes, the 4 core attributes are floor, view, bedroom furniture, and internet availability. There's also 4 filler attributes that were randomly determined. And here are the results for the hotel version. So as you can see, or what you can see in this plot is there are individual panels for each of the core attributes. There are 5 because one of the core attributes, floor, had 3 different levels. The y-axis measures the Ampsi magnitudes with point estimates and cluster robust 95% confidence intervals. The x-axis denotes the number of filler attributes shown alongside the core attributes. So this goes from 0 fillers, i.e. conjoint profiles with only the 4 core attributes, all the way up to 18, so really large 22 attribute tables. And what you can see is that as fillers are added, there is some attenuation of the Ampsi estimates, but it's actually relatively moderate attenuation. So for instance, when the size of the conjoint table is tripled, the Ampsis still retain about 2/3 of their magnitude. And perhaps even more importantly than that, that moderate attenuation occurs at roughly the same rate across all of the core attributes, such that the ordering of the Ampsi magnitudes remains the same across the 4 core attributes, regardless of the number of fillers respondents are shown. So in other words, while satisficing appears to result in some attenuation, it'd be kind of very surprising and kind of crazy if it didn't lead to any, we don't find it to systematically alter the pattern of results, thereby ensuring that our broad interpretation of the results would remain unchanged. The results for the candidate version were similar, though with less attenuation. This likely owed to the fact that our fillers in the candidate choice were less meaningful for respondent choice. And in our candidate experiment, we actually included an additional 30 fillers. So some of the profiles that people were shown were ridiculously large. So here are the results for the Ampsis, and then we also have results for the partial R squared. This is a partial R squared for models including only the core attributes. You can see that there's little to no detectable change as more attributes, more filler attributes are shown. Okay, so moving on to the second study, this I think is a little bit more straightforward. So on the number of tasks in Satisficing, the design and results are straightforward because we don't need to worry about complications like the masking issue. And so to remind you that in this study, we're interested in finding out if response patterns and quality change as respondents work through an increasing number of conjoint tasks, right? So if you're designing a conjoint experiment, you want to decide, or should I show respondents 5 pairs or 10 pairs or 25 pairs? What can I get away with doing without sacrificing quality? And so in this case, the design involved only a single stage and was really simple, at least compared to the previous study. We used a paired profile design. The subject matter was presidential vote choice. And in this design, we had only 2 core attributes, which were included in all profiles: partisanship and the education level of the hypothetical presidential candidates. In addition, respondents were randomly assigned up to 18 other attributes. In this case, we're not interested in changes as the number of attributes changes, so our presentation of the results will pool over these conditions. What we're interested in is how things change as respondents complete more tasks. And so to this effect, we had respondents complete a total of 30 task choices total. So actually looking at 30 different tables, and we evaluated how response patterns changed as they moved through those tasks. Implemented this on both MTurk and SSI. And so here are the results now with the x-axis specifying the task number. And you can see quite clearly, there's little to no attenuation of the Ampsis as respondents work their way through an increasing number of tasks, suggesting little to no sensitivity to Satisficing in terms of the number of tasks. This is for the MTurkers, here's for SSI, and we get the same thing when looking at the partial R squared. So there's a little drop down after the very first task, but after that, it's completely flat, more or less. Okay, so as I mentioned, in these profiles, respondents were randomly shown up to 18 additional attributes. And so one might wonder whether the Ampsis for those other attributes, which may be less fundamentally important for respondent choice than the 2 core attributes, are also stable across tasks. And it turns out that they are, which I show in these plots here. So here's some of those. So to summarize the results so far, our results indicated a surprising robustness of conjoint designs with respect to both the number of attributes and number of tasks. And this leads to, I think, some concrete recommendations that can be made on the basis of these findings. So first, our results suggest that Satisficing does not impose a really serious binding constraint on conjoint experiment designs, right? Obviously it's happening, but it doesn't seem to be happening to the extent that it really is the key design factor. Of course, there were upper limits on the number of attributes and tasks we considered in our studies, but we purposely set these levels way above conventional practice. So assuming one stays under these reasonable limits, so like under 30 tasks and under 20 attributes, which most people are going to do anyway, our recommendation is to basically not worry too much about Satisficing. You must still worry about all the other important experimental design considerations, but we're freeing you from having to overthink, account for, or overreact to concerns about Satisficing. So instead, you should make your design decisions on the basis of other criteria. So for the number of attributes, you should prioritize the profile design to best account for masking in a way that gets at your theoretical question of interest, as well as realism of profiles. And for the number of tasks, you should prioritize considerations like statistical power, survey length, and cost constraints. Okay, so moving on to the second tract of research, I just showed evidence that conjoint results are remarkably robust to the addition of attributes and tasks, but a key question remaining is, why is this the case? And despite the growing use of conjoint experiments across the social sciences and methodological developments in design and statistical analysis of conjoint experiments, I think perhaps the most glaring gap is the paucity of systematic knowledge on the underlying decision-making processes that respondents use when completing conjoint surveys. And of course, the implications of understanding these dynamics more fully are significant, with the possibility of giving us more leverage on theoretical considerations like how best to interpret results and the extent of their external validity, as well as practical considerations related to design. And so in that vein, a set of colleagues and I set out to tackle, or at least partially tackle, this question specifically by using eye tracking methods, so we could collect rich data that directly measures respondents' attention as they work their way through conjoint experiments. Now, if you want an in-depth introduction on how eye tracking works, I'd point you to the methods section of this paper. But the basic idea is this. So using a specialized eye tracking monitor with built-in infrared cameras, the eye tracker can locate a subject's gaze, that is where they're looking at any given moment, and subjects' gaze points, which are recorded 60 times per second, can then be classified into saccades, which are rapid eye movements during which someone's not actually looking at anything, and fixations, the key eye tracking units of analysis. These are periods in which the eyes remain relatively still and hence allow for someone to actually process the information they're looking at. So our goal was to investigate design effects on choice behavior and visual attention, namely by assessing respondents' patterns of eye fixations and eye movements across different conditions of varying complexity, which I'll explain. So our conjoint experimental scenario for this study was the familiar presidential candidate choice. That is, subjects were shown multiple candidate profiles side by side in a table where each profile included multiple attributes describing the candidate, whose values were randomized and respondents were asked to choose their preferred candidate. So you're very familiar at this point. As already discussed, our underlying goal was to investigate the effect of key design dimensions on respondents' behavior and visual attention. And so to that end, we included 6 experimental conditions, or what I'll call blocks, comprising varying levels of design complexity. So specifically for each block, the number of attributes per profile was set to either 5, 8, or 11, and the number of candidates for each profile was set to either 2 or 3, so capturing a range of settings that are commonly found in applications of conjoints in political science. And for each subject completed all 6 blocks in a randomly assigned order, and each individual block was comprised of a sequence of 20 conjoint tables, which I'll refer to as decision tasks. For each subject block, attributes were randomly drawn from the full list of 11 attributes, and the order in which the attributes were displayed on the table was also randomized for each subject block, with that order held fixed across decision tasks for a respondent to avoid confusion. So here is an example of a randomly generated profile for respondents who see 5 attributes and 2 profiles. So that this is the 5 attribute 2 profile block. The attributes, of course, are the rows, and the profiles are the columns, just like we've been seeing before. And here is an example on the opposite end of the complexity spectrum with 11 attributes and 3 profiles. So you have comparison and complexity, quite stark. And then we have all sorts of conditions in between. And the full list of attributes and attribute values are listed in this table, include age, gender, race, previous occupation, military service, prior political experience, party, religion, and positions on 3 policy issues. So our sample in this case, since this was an in-lab eye tracking experiment, was much smaller than in previous studies, but it consisted of 122 subjects. It was run at Duke University in July 2019 and included undergraduate and graduate students as well as members of the local community. And the median completion time for this was 35 minutes, so quite a bit longer than one would typically have for an online experiment. So just to make sure we have that in context. Okay, so I'll now turn to our findings on how the conjoint table design affected respondent survey taking behavior, beginning with the Ampsis of the various attributes. So there's a lot going on here. We don't need to focus on everything, but what this figure shows are the Ampsi estimates, along with confidence intervals, broken down by these 6 experimental conditions, which range from the less complex conjoint table, the least complex conjoint table with 5 attributes and 2 profiles in this top left panel, and the most complex with 11 attributes and 3 profiles in this bottom right. And so no need to go through all these results in detail. And there's a lot of information contained in this, but the key result, the key takeaway to consider when we go on to analyze the eye tracking data is that the main patterns are actually quite stable across the increasing levels of complexity. It's not like things are really changing dramatically as you go from the least to the most complex design. Of course, that's not to say there are absolutely no significant changes across the conditions. Indeed, there certainly are some differences. And given that some of these attributes likely mask each other, Ampsi should not remain absolutely identical as additional attributes are added to the design. But the broad patterns and the relative magnitudes of the attributes are largely unchanged across blocks. It's not as though the kind of general high-level inferences interpretation we get change that much, if at all, if we go from the most complex to the least complex version. Right. So again, we're not seeing dramatic attenuation as the design becomes increasingly complex, as we saw in the previous results, and in contrast to what conventional wisdom on survey satisficing would suggest. And so given this relative robustness, how are respondents actually adjusting their visual attention as the complexity of the design increases? That would be a question that we certainly had and that one might have. And this figure shown here reveals one of our key eye tracking results. Specifically, the figure shows the proportion of cells in the conjoint table that are viewed by subjects, that is actually looked at with one's eye fixations on average across the decision tasks in each of these 6 conditions. So as you can see, there is a marked decline in the proportion of cells that people are viewing as complexity increases. Right? So for instance, while subjects view about 71% of the total cells on average in the least complex condition, this metric decreases monotonically as complexity increases until subjects view only about 45% of the cells in the most complex condition. Holding the number of attributes constant, the proportion of cells drops as we increase the number of profiles from 2 to 3, the number of candidates from 2 to 3. And holding the number of profiles constant, the proportion of cells viewed drops about 10%, by about 10 percentage points, and then another 10 percentage points when we go from 5 to 8 to 11 attributes. So we can also assess how respondents change their visual attention as they work through more tasks. This figure shows OS regression fits the proportion of cells viewed across tasks as they continue to rate more tasks. With the task number shown on the x-axis. And as you can see, there's a very small decline. So taken together, these 2 sets of results seem to demonstrate that subjects adjust their information gathering processes and focus their visual attention on a smaller fraction of the overall information presented to them as the conjoint table grows in complexity and as they become more familiar with the decision tasks. So now that first eye tracking finding in particular, that respondents process a smaller fraction of information when presented with more complex tables, might seem quite surprising given that the Ampsis remain fairly stable across the different designs. So what might explain this seemingly paradoxical result? How can respondents make similar choices even though they're processing a smaller fraction of the information? Well, it turns out that as the complexity of the design increases, while subjects consume a smaller proportion of the overall information, the absolute amount of information they process actually increases as measured by the number of cells that they view. So they view a smaller proportion of cells, but still view a larger overall number of cells. And the number of cells and the number of fixations they employ to consume those cells, to actually process that information. So these findings taken all together are consistent with the decision-making process of bounded rationality, where subjects react to increased complexity by selectively incorporating relevant additional information. That is, they focus on new information about attributes that matter most to them and ignore additional information they consider irrelevant to reduce the computational cost, the cognitive cost of processing more information. And so consistent with this, we find that even though subjects on average, as I mentioned, view a smaller proportion of the total number of cells as the design gets more complex, they still view a considerably larger number of cells. In addition, we also find that a stable learning process occurs over tasks such that respondents become more efficient without changing their choice behavior. This figure shows the number of fixations, the number of actual times looking at the cells that respondents take as they work through additional tasks. So you see they are able to get through tasks more efficiently as they work through familiar profiles. And in spite of that increased efficiency, there's virtually no change in choice behavior, as shown by the stability of the Ampsis across early tasks, tasks 1 through 10, relative to late tasks, tasks 11 through 20. So in summary for all this, we've leveraged eye tracking methods to examine how respondents process information when completing conjoint surveys, and have aimed to shed some new light on the underlying mechanisms that determine how they process information. So our findings not only help explain why conjoint designs can possibly be so robust to increasing complexity, but also why we can still be confident in the inferences we draw from respondents' choices, even as we make their tasks more complex. If respondents were to react to added complexity by paying less attention in general, their choices would not accurately reflect attribute importance as conjoint tables become too large. And that would be a serious cause for concern for us as we try to design experiments with larger tables. But in contrast, however, what we found is respondents are able to adjust to added complexity in ways that allow them to process relevant information more efficiently. So hence, increases in the complexity of the conjoint task will not necessarily compromise the inferences that can be drawn from the observed choices. Of course, all this comes with the caution and the caveat that we had a very particular sample, so there are open questions on whether these results would generalize to other samples. So I don't want to hide that. But essentially, this research helps bolster our earlier findings that as long as we're not talking about ridiculously large number of attributes, tasks, or profiles, that researchers should not be too worried or about overly complex conjoint tables from the standpoint of what respondents should be able to handle. And actually, to conclude, what I want to note is that our study suggests that there's some important next steps for future work. Eye tracking data has been thus far under-leveraged among, I think, methodologists, and there are ample opportunities to use these technologies to address questions of interest in political science and political methodology and survey design more generally, completely aside from conjoint experiments. And follow-up research could include things like analyses of social desirability bias, decision-making strategies, and heterogeneity in information processing. We're hoping that our study can serve as a little bit of a blueprint for future studies.
Kirk, if I might ask two clarification questions.
Sure.
First,
Yes,
one is in the chat by Gil. He asks if all results were estimated on an individual level.
So the results are averaged across response. So yeah, all the results, certainly when we're talking about the Ampsis are defined at the average level. And in terms of the eye tracking results, when we're looking at the number of fixations, number of cells, those are averaged for the specific block. So for instance, this particular block refers to the block with 5 attributes and 2 candidates.
And another question that I wanted to ask is whether you kept the order of the attributes relatively stable, so that the additional attributes that you added were like below the attributes that the respondent already saw, and if not, did you see them move their eyes to the attributes that are most important to them?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so within the block, we held the order of the attributes fixed. I think your question implies that you understand that. But across different blocks, the order was re-randomized. So if in one block it happened to be that party was the first attribute, that didn't necessarily mean that party would be the first attribute. We re-randomized things across blocks. And what we do find, since if we look at the results, across different blocks, for instance, the fact that position on same-sex marriage is stable across all these different blocks suggests that people are going to find that issue regardless of where it is in the table. But we didn't look at that specifically.
Thank you. And I see that there is a question from Israel.
Oh, thank you. Hi, thanks, Kirk, for a really interesting talk. I just have, I think, one comment. First of all, I love the combination with eye tracking. I wonder, because when I see this graph that you're presenting here, and I'm puzzled that even with 50% or less viewership, you still get some decent results. And I would like to propose perhaps a reason is that with eye tracking at 60 Hertz, you're unable to see saccades. And if you were to do this at 120 or at least 250, I think that you'll be able to see that people are able, even from short drops of the eyes that you are unable to monitor at 60 Hertz, that they are still able to see much more than what you report in this figure.
That's interesting. I will bring that comment to my colleague who is the expert on eye tracking. But certainly in the design of the actual eye tracking methods, we tried to follow best practices in that literature. So, but no, this is the useful information to know. Thank you.
You're welcome. There are no best practices, by the way. There's been I think if you search,
it's a Wild West right now.
The use of eye tracking in communication studies overview. It's kind of like, well, since the 1970s it's been used, but there's a huge increase. But I would say that there's been a review article from last year in communication studies, and you'll find that people use from 60 hertz to 250, and there's not even a standard of reporting results. So
that's interesting.
Go for it.
No, that's very interesting. So that what you're saying would suggest that all of these bars would increase in size.
I believe they will. You'll be able to see gazes, not gazes, but saccades, and you'll see that they're going higher.
Interesting.
Maybe.
Thank you. As switching gears a little bit, as I already mentioned, the most common causal estimand in recent work is the Ampsi. This is due to an influential article written about 5 years ago, and that reveals its clear popularity and the various advantages it has, such as really incredible empirical tractability. But the focus on the Ampsi in applied work is not at all without critique. Indeed, in the past few years, there's been an increasing amount of theoretical and methodological attention on the Ampsi itself, what it represents, and more broadly on what conjoint data can and cannot recover. And in particular, some of this work has focused on conjoint data and critique of using the Ampsi in the context of voting or election applications, which make up obviously a substantial share of recent applied conjoint analyses in political science. And so in more recent work, my colleagues and I have sought to illuminate the formal and conceptual underpinnings of the Ampsi, clarify what it does and does not do, and highlight some of its ostensible weaknesses, and highlight how some of those ostensible weaknesses actually make it an extremely interesting and useful quantity of interest. So again, let's take a look at the Ampsi that I used, a slightly simplified formalization I introduced earlier for convenience. The Ampsi, as I mentioned, focuses on one particular attribute. You can define an Ampsi for any attribute, but for any given attribute, we define an Ampsi. And in this example, let's say attribute A, the capital A. And so this expression for the Ampsi is the expression for the Ampsi when you have a binary attribute A, which takes values 1 or 0. So this is the same as we saw before. It's the expected difference between the potential outcomes for paired contests for attribute A for the first profile equals 1, and potential outcomes for all contests where A for the first profile equals 0, given a pre-specified distribution of all the other attributes. Okay, so now some important additional remarks are in order, right? So first, obviously, the Ampsi is a one-number summary. So just like with any summary metric, it's going to need to condense and simplify a lot of information to get down to that single number. And the way it does that is through double averaging. The two dimensions which that double averaging occurs on are first across the attributes or profile distribution, that is all the capital letters in the estimand. Those are random variables with joint distributions that need to be defined or assumed, and then we take the expectation over them. And second, the expectation is also taken with respect to the target population, that is the population of interest of respondents or voters or whoever, denoted by I. Now, a really great thing about this double averaging, which is very well known and accounts for the Ampsi's wild popularity, is that it makes the Ampsi extremely tractable empirically. In fact, it can be estimated via really straightforward techniques such as simple differences in means or ordinary least squares. However, these properties also highlight some really important cautions. One of these is that due to the averaging across attributes, this means that the Ampsi for any one attribute does formally depend upon the distribution of all the other attributes as well. And this implies that the Ampsi will actually change if the attribute distribution is changed. So I'm not talking about adding more attributes, I'm talking about changing the randomization distribution of the other attributes. So it's really key to note that this is obviously formally true, but the seriousness of this consideration in practical terms really depends on how strong the interactions are between the different attributes. If there are not really strong interactions between the attributes relative to the marginal effects, that's really not much of a practical issue. So that's something important to investigate. Are there really strong, meaningful interactions between one's attributes? In addition, it's also key to note that the Ampsi compares a change in the attribute of interest for the same profile. It's not a difference in attributes across profiles. So in other words, it's not the difference between candidate where A equals 1 and candidate where A equals 0. That's not the right way to understand and interpret the Ampsi. Okay, so now on the basis of these unique properties of the Ampsi, there's been recent, really interesting work by scholars who have related the underpinnings of the Ampsi to formal definitions of preferences, specifically full orderings of the preferences of all alternatives, that is, preference orderings for all the different profiles. Based on this work, it's been noted that one needs to be really careful when interpreting the Ampsi, particularly in the voting and election context, because in addition to incorporating preference directionality with respect to an attribute, it also incorporates preference intensity. And what this means is the Ampsi is not and should not be interpreted as a measure of majority preferences. And this is an important note to make in juxtaposition with how applied researchers often interpret their Ampsi estimates. So the key point to make here is that this is a problem primarily for how people are interpreting Ampsis, not with the identification or definition of the Ampsi itself. This is actually, in fact, analogous to the case of an average treatment effect. For instance, in a simple single treatment experiment, where a positive ATE does not necessarily mean a positive individual level causal effect for the majority of the people. We would need to get the median of the individual level treatment effects, which is, of course, not going to be possible to identify unless you're able to figure out a way to either go back in time or have individuals be exposed to many different things. All right, so in our paper, we show how these properties of the Ampsis have been critiqued by some, are actually a valuable feature, not a bug, that leads the Ampsi to inherit several desirable properties as a result. It allows it to capture multidimensionality or trade-offs. It allows it to map onto meaningful empirical phenomena of interest, and it makes it empirically tractable with very credible assumptions. Now, I don't have time to go into the full details, but to sort of provide some very high-level intuition on why incorporating preference intensity is important for understanding how people choose between multidimensional objects, consider a very simple thought experiment. Imagine you only cared about preference directionality and not intensity at all. That would imply that you were interested, for instance, in something like the fraction of voters who prefer big A equals A versus little a prime. So as a thought experiment, imagine big A is handedness, that is whether a candidate is right-handed or left-handed. Well, it turns out that 90% of the world is right-handed. And given how tribal people tend to be, it's probably safe to say that left-handed people are proud of being left-handed and right-handed people probably just don't trust left-handed people. So imagine everyone prefers a candidate who shares their handedness, all else equal. But of course, handedness is only one of many attributes to be considered. If focused on a metric that ignores preference intensity and only focused on preference directionality, what would then happen is that handedness would appear to be incredibly important. It would perhaps even seem to dominate many other attributes despite its electoral irrelevance, because while 90% of voters prefer right-handed candidates, a huge number, no reasonable number is actually going to make their voting decisions on the basis of handedness when given other information about attributes. This multidimensionality of the profiles and choice tasks is a vital part of how people actually make their decisions, and preference intensity factors into that and should factor into that. And the Ampsi takes this into account by design. A second reason why we should like the Ampsi in the context of voting and election studies is its incorporation of preference intensity when applied to elections actually gives the Ampsi a straightforward, politically meaningful interpretation as the average causal effect of an attribute on a candidate's or party's expected vote share. And importantly, this equivalence between Ampsis and effects on vote shares holds regardless of the structure of voter preferences. That is to say, for researchers who are interested in the effects of candidate or party attributes on vote shares in particular, the Ampsi is literally a key core quantity of interest. And if you're wondering how many people out there actually care about vote shares as their outcome variable. Well, you might be someone who does, but if you're not familiar with how many people do, we conducted a literature review, including all articles on voting in the APSR, AJPS, electoral studies, and political behavior, and found that. And these are journals that commonly publish studies on voting behavior. We did this from 2015 to 2019 and found of the 82 articles that were in this scope, 87% included either aggregate vote shares or their individual level analogs as a key outcome. So the small minority of studies that do not feature outcomes related to vote shares instead have outcomes such as the probability of a candidate or party winning. So not only does the Ampsi recover politically and electorally meaningful quantity, it also recovers a quantity that's been of primary interest in most non-conjoint studies in recent years. So I see I'm running out of time, so I'll very quickly just not go through all the rest of the material, just note what I'm going to be missing. So just want to note that another line of methods research in conjoint experiments is investigating alternative quantities of interest aside from the Ampsi. Obviously, you can't answer every question with the Ampsi, and this involves formalizing alternative quantities, but also figuring out how to estimate them. And in this paper that I just talked about, we also formalize and investigate the tractability of two other quantities. The first is how likely is a candidate with A equals A to win a majority, or how likely is A equals A to beat A equals a little a. So essentially, the first alternative quantity study the relationship between attributes and the probability of a candidate or a party winning rather than the effect on vote shares. And these are just two versions of how to do this. Without going too much into the details, because of the complexity of this expression, the fact that there's an indicator function sandwiched in between two expectations, you can't take a purely non-parametric approach to this. So instead, we used a model-based approach that allows us to recover estimates of this quantity, and using simulated data so we know what the truth is. We checked to see the effectiveness of this particular method for actually recovering the truth. And so the red dots are the truth for various contrasts, and then we have the estimates in black. And as you can see, the fact that the overlay suggests, at least in this, in varying levels of complexity in our simulations, right? Simulations are what they are, but at least in these simulations shows that there's feasibility, at least kind of first order feasibility to this. An alternative quantity could be the fraction who prefers a particular attribute over a separate attribute. So this would be essentially reversing the order of the expectations from the previous. And what this means is that you actually have to have individual level estimates. And so that's obviously very tricky because you need to generate enough data at the individual level to be able to say, this is a person who prefers male candidates to female candidates. This is a person who prefers someone who has military experience versus does not. And you have to be able to do that very reliably. And so using a similar type of estimation methodology to see how feasible this was, we found that it's not very. And the problem is precisely because by swapping the order of the expectations, it's just very difficult to generate enough data at the individual level to be able to do this reliably. And there's all sorts of other applications of like this, like the application I just showed, trying to leverage machine learning data with conjoint data. Machine learning methods on conjoint data to estimate different types of things, such as the popularity of specific profiles rather than the effect of one attribute on another, using flexible modeling responses like ridge regression or stochastic gradient boosted trees. This is something that I did with some colleagues, including Yotam Margalit, who's at Tel Aviv University, looking at the popularity of different austerity packages. So I'll stop there since I know I'm out of time, but I should at least go to the final slide, which shows all the different studies that I have referenced throughout this slide deck, some of which are my own, but many of which are done by other really interesting scholars. So that's it, and I'm happy to take any questions or go back to clarify anything that I had to go through too quickly. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm opening the floor for questions. You can either raise your hand or write them in the chat. I saw that Libby had a question earlier, so you can begin, I think.
Yes, thank you, Clarita, and thank you, Kirk, for your presentation. I was considering of using a conjoint method in one of my PhD papers. I'm a PhD student, but eventually decided on a regular experiment. But I'm still thinking of doing this afterwards on my research team. I have two questions. One is like a technical question: whether you included in your surveys an additional attention item, such as an instructional manipulation check, to make sure that the respondents are alert, and because the results you show kind of surprised me. They're very positive and show that respondents are really serious and reading the questions and thinking about that. And I wanted to ask if you added additional items to ensure that. The second question is a more general one. That's actually the reason why I decided not to use conjoint in my study, is regards the contexts and the domains on which you can apply a conjoint to. And specifically, what do you think about applying it on a context where in the real world there isn't a choice? So specifically, if you want to understand citizens, people's preferences, but on a case where in real world they don't really have a choice. So, for example, a not hypothetical one, governments, different qualities or different characteristics. So they don't really get to choose how their government works, right? But you want to understand how the different combinations of attributions affect their trust or preference or support or whatever. But in real world, they don't really get to choose that. So do you think conjoint is the right choice, is applicable to this context? That's it.
Yeah, so taking your second question first, I think absolutely. So obviously everything comes down to one's research question and what one wants to get at. At the very bare minimum, by focusing on an issue where people might not actually get a choice, you at least still get some theoretical results that could be interesting. If we go from that to understanding like to what extent do they have real world implications for how politics works or what happens in the power dynamic at play, even if people don't actually have a choice, that will still allow you to understand to what extent will people be angry about certain choices that are made. And obviously, even if they can't choose those choices, that type of anger or dissatisfaction can have real implications for what people choose to do, how people choose to mobilize. And this can be the case in any country. And then, of course, there are obviously some applications where the conjoint is meant to be a little bit more mapping onto an actual real world choice, like the choice between candidates. There's always a question, even in that case, even where you're presented with a choice that people actually see in the real world, there's still a question, always is a question about just how externally valid this is, right? In the real world, people aren't looking at an election, at a ballot where they have a conjoint profile, and in the real world, they're often going to choose between just a handful of candidates, not the thousands and thousands of candidates that could be randomly generated via profiles. But all of this still, I think, gets at really important high-level theoretical findings that can guide very generalizable understandings of what people care about. And so I think that takeaway applies to any type of issue context, regardless of just how much that maps onto real choices we make in the real world. And with respect to your first question, so in some of these studies that we had, and some of this depends on how long they were, how many tasks, how complex, we have some attention checks, and then some, for instance, the eye tracking experiment, where people saw all 6 blocks, and each block contained 20 different profiles. So 120 profiles, 120 pairs of profiles that they saw total. In the middle of that, we had them kind of relax a little bit and watch a video and make sure that they were still engaged. But one thing I would say is, so the conventional wisdom on survey research is if you have people do something that's really long or repetitive, they might get bored. In a lot of the experiments we've run, we have open-ended questions at the end, just like asking people, what did you think about this? And people often take the opportunity to share with us the extent to which they like liked doing the survey instrument. And what we found is with conjoint experiments, a lot of people like really enjoy them. They view it as really engaging. They don't necessarily share why that is the case, but I imagine there's kind of like a fun element to working through a decision task that is familiar enough, right, that they can get through it and really understand what they're doing. A decision between candidates, or I've done some work on preferences with respect to asylum seekers and immigrants, or policy packages, but different enough from what they're doing on a daily basis that they remain engaged.
Thank you.
Eran, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Kirk. I'm sorry for a really interesting talk. I have a question. I know this is not a direct response to any of the data you've presented, but a more like a different question, which is how to, like, what are the main considerations for handling implausible combinations of attribute levels? So for example, how do I make sure, do I want to make sure? Probably yes. Or how do I do that? That I don't give people a profile where, I don't know, a right-wing politician is presenting an extreme left or extremely liberal policy position, or someone who's young has a lot of experience more than it really makes sense. But then, so this is one part of the question, but then also your example with handedness, I think it also raises a relevant question here, which I'm sure people in this literature have thought about, which is about the proportion of people who get each attribute level, right? Because if 90% of people are right-handed, then, and if I randomly assign people with those attribute levels, then I will get more or less 50-50, more or less. And that might have a serious impact on my results and their validity. So maybe you can say at least something about the main considerations or some important references to on how to think about this, because I think these are like important questions.
Yeah, no, definitely they are important questions, and the short answer, and I'll be a little bit more comprehensive, but the short answer to your question is one can choose whatever randomization distribution they want in designing and executing the conjoint experiment. So with getting a little bit more comprehensive than that, with respect to implausible combinations, what researchers will often do is make sure that the randomization never produces that combination. So you'll never have a candidate that is super right-wing with a super left-wing position on an issue. If you have party or ideology and you have a position, some people will choose to include those kind of unlikely profiles, as long as they're not like kind of metaphysically impossible or like so implausible that it just seems ridiculous. And the reason they want to do that is because they're interested in isolating the effects of certain things. So I don't know how it breaks down in terms of the number of people who will X that out, but certainly for profiles that seem to be impossible, like a medical doctor with only a high school degree, right? People will almost generally, as a rule of thumb, make sure that profile does not show up. And then in terms of the proportion of profiles that are generated with a particular level or not, and this is partially to create realism, and partially if there are interactions between different attributes, you want this to reflect that. This is easier to do. You just change the marginal randomization distribution of individual attributes. So in the example you gave, if I were to include handedness in the profiles of my candidates, I'd make sure that 90% of the time right-handed showed up and 10% of the time left-handed showed up. And that actually is much easier to deal with from both the design and analysis side of things than when you are changing the joint distribution of attributes. When you change the joint, none of this changes the definition or identification of the Ampsi, but it will affect the actual estimate you get, right, if there are interactions. And certainly if you are making it such that certain attributes are perfectly correlated with one another, that is going to limit your ability to completely disaggregate the effects of one versus another. But if that's the way it is in the real world, and you want to stick to what's in the real world, then I see nothing wrong with that, and that's a perfectly reasonable way to go.
Thanks very much. I guess it would be a short follow-up, but I guess it would be interesting, maybe people have already done that, to see whether any of those, like not doing any of those things, leads to more satisficing, right? So if you get 10 profiles and half the people are left-handed, for example, or some unlikely profiles, maybe, I don't know, you like take the survey less seriously because, I don't know, you're not sure that this is representative of anything that's really happening in the world. Yeah, thanks very much anyway.
Yeah, no, this is actually something that a colleague and I have been considering, for sure. Yeah, it's a nice research idea.
There is a follow-up question in the chat by Dvir on Vivi's comment. He asks, what would be the downsides of a single profile conjoint, if any? Yeah, no,
there's that's definitely a consideration that one can take. So obviously, if you have a single profile, your outcome variable would need to be some sort of independent rating or acceptance type of thing. So you can't have a forced choice. So the theoretical downsides would be that it might not kind of replicate or reflect the type of decision people would be making in the real world. I think that's probably the most relevant when you're thinking about real world choices that going to Libby's question, so choices between candidates. But certainly if you're thinking about evaluating austerity packages or lots of different things, people aren't actually choosing between 2 profiles or 3 profiles. They're given one, and then we hope, or politicians hope, that they're going to like it. And so in that case, certainly there's no downside, I think, to having a single profile, other than the possibility that by giving people multiple profiles at a time, it might allow them to more efficiently process information and kind of have reference points. But one thing to note is, even in situations where people present more than one profile at a time, this has been the case in my own work, depending on what one's research question is, one might opt to actually use outcome variables that are not the forced choice. So in that paper that I didn't really get to talk about but mentioned on evaluating austerity packages, the way that we analyzed the conjoint data for a portion of our analyses, for a core part of our analyses, was not actually looking at the forced choices between 2 profiles. We were looking at independent evaluations of the individual profiles. And in that case, we could have just as easily shown a single profile on a page rather than multiple profiles at a time.
I also have a question. Many of the examples of conjoints that I saw, they are packages that relate to attributes of, for example, candidate or a person, and then most of the attributes are of the same type, or if it's a policy, then some attributes of the policy. And I was wondering, like in the example that you presented, that you have attributes that are policies and like the candidate's position with respect to some issues and sociodemographic attributes, whether it is, I don't know, more burdening or more complicated for respondents. And additionally, I saw some examples where the profile is a policy package where each attribute is a package on a different issue. So for example, like a COVID containment strategy, when one attribute would be how the government treats masks, and the other one vaccination. And I was wondering if you think it's a suitable application, or if it increases too much the cognitive burden on the respondent, and then this basically.
Yeah, no, I would say to both of these questions, I'm not really sure. I don't know. It's a good question though. So if using attributes that are more fine-grained or continuous in values, and this is precisely what we did with the austerity packages, and we didn't compare that sort of design with a design where we had like a smaller number of levels for the spending cuts and tax increases. So I don't know if going from one versus going from one to the other would have changed results that much. What I will say is, with the results that we got, it was clear that that respondents were able to process it sufficiently that we got meaningful results. That's all I can say about that. So that at least suggests that that there should be no reason to think that giving people continuous values is going to overburden them. Obviously, I think it's going to depend on just how complicated the material is, and austerity packages is something that I think is probably more complex than thinking about choices between candidates, but it's also something that is in the news every so often, and certainly in the countries that we were studying this kind of at the height of their respective financial crises. So something that at least voters who might actually make decisions on the basis of those types of things are going to be familiar with kind of getting through. And then in terms of second question, what was the second part of your question?
If the profile is for example, comprised of attributes that are policies on different issues. So it's not that it's attributes of one policy, but it is like a strategy of policies. For example, an attribute that is policy for wearing masks, how to handle it, and another attribute that is how to manage border control during COVID. And so then the respondent comprises several policies actually, and not several attributes of a given policy.
I see. Yeah, I think so. Again, I'll be honest and say I don't know like how cognitively burdensome that would be, but my intuition would be that people would be able to get through it, and they probably this is kind of is related to the results from the eye tracking results, where people are getting through things that are very complicated through bounded rationality. If looking at the entire table and the entire ensemble of different policies is too complicated, they're going to focus on the one or two or three or however many they can handle that's most important to them, and probably just ignore the others. That's what I think would probably happen. And my guess is within that package of many different policies, as long as there are some that people can understand, and certainly the ones that you just mentioned are things that we can all understand, my guess is you'd get meaningful results, and you'd at least be able to interpret those as which policies do people care most about, right? You could compare the relative magnitudes of the attributes for policy A versus those of policy B, and so on, and see like which ones are, if people have to make a trade-off, which ones are they more willing to sacrifice, and which ones do they really want to prioritize of course, on average.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I want to thank you very much for this talk. It was great. And if you could share with us the slides, it would be also very cool for everybody here. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for being here and for having me.
Thank you very much, Kirk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.